Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to our LogiPharma LogiMed webinar sponsored by Shipware, the top 3 negotiation pitfalls, your step-by-step on leveraging fulfillment data analytics in 2021. Thank you for joining us. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today, Matt Bond, Senior Consultant at Shipware, and Steve Gibbons, Managing Director of 3PL Optimization at Shipware. Now, without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Matt. Take it away.
Thanks, Olivia, and thank you everybody for attending today. Really appreciate the time. We're going to go over some of the pitfalls, the top 3 pitfalls that you might encounter when trying to negotiate a parcel contract or a 3PL contract in a lot of detail. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to answer, and we'll get to those at the end. Quickly, a little bit about me. I'm a senior consultant at Shipware. We're a San Diego-based firm specializing in cost reduction and recovery. We'll tell you a little bit more about Shipware on the next slide, but personally, I came directly to Shipware from FedEx, where I worked as a pricing advisor for 9 years. Some of the largest FedEx customers in the 500 million range in e-commerce and healthcare, as well as some smaller companies as well as I worked my way up. So we've seen a lot of different companies. And the insight that we're providing today is going to be based on a lot of that history and Steve's history as well. Also had some background designing the systems that they're currently using, so very familiar with everything FedEx. About Shipware, we have 2 sides of our business, and that's the consulting arm and a technology arm. The consulting side focuses on parcel, LTL, and 3PL optimization, where we take a contract that you're currently shipping on, analyze it, and look for areas for improvement, and then help shippers realize those areas for improvement. We also do this on time and transit packaging. Our technology arm looks at auditing packages for late and lost deliveries. And we also offer spend management analytics. So if you're looking at a high-level snapshot of where your packages are going with the ability to drill down into lots and lots of detail, that's available on our portal, and we'll show you some screenshots from that along the way as we go. If you do have any more questions about the company or about us, please feel free to ask or follow up with us after. Steve, go ahead and jump in and introduce yourself as well.
Sounds good, Matt. Thanks for the intro. And I also appreciate everybody joining today. My name is Steve Gibbons, and I'm the Managing Director of 3PL Optimization at Shipware. I've got over 25 years experience in the fulfillment industry, and I've founded, built, and sold 3PLs, and I have a lot of experience in the area of really in the healthcare vertical. I've worked with medical devices companies, pharmaceutical companies, nutraceutical, and also hospital systems. I'm responsible for fulfillment services optimization, engagement strategy, and execution. And me and my team are really focused on value-based adaptive sourcing strategies for 3PL fulfillment and transportation optimization, and with an ultimate goal of delivering value to our clients in the form of cost reduction, service improvement, and increased customer satisfaction. Before we jump into the meat of the presentation, we wanted to just kind of set it up a little bit. So as far as the healthcare industry goes in particular, there's a lot of regulatory and compliance requirements that are very specific to healthcare. So we want to just touch on those real quick to set the foundation for the things that we're going to discuss today. So within healthcare, there's many different segments, and there's many different support requirements. There's various regulatory and compliance requirements from FDA regulated products like medical devices, pharmaceuticals, and nutraceuticals. There's also important considerations in the area of quality when you're selecting a provider like CGMP and ISO 9001 and 13045. In addition to that, there's other very specific requirements that our customers have, like expiration date tracking, lot tracking, FIFO inventory management, temperature control, and hazmat requirements.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to cover the pitfalls that we're looking into on the parcel side, and then Steve will jump back in at the end and go through these again on the 3PL side. But when we talk to our clients and prospects on a daily basis, we consistently come across three major things that we see shippers having issue with. And the first one is misunderstanding the pricing agreements themselves, which are very complex and designed to be so. I can tell you that it takes about 6 months as a FedEx pricing analyst full-time to really understand everything in a pricing agreement, so they can be intimidating. Two is that a lot of shippers do not analyze their proposals correctly. They exclude things like minimum charges, don't take into account impacts of accessorials, and then oftentimes fail to negotiate effectively. When we ask how they've negotiated in the past, a lot of times it will be things around just give me your best offer, or we're looking to stay with you, but we'd like to see some improvements. And generally, those are not the most effective ways. So we'll help you overcome some of those challenges and give you some strategies to better be equipped on these three items. So first, let's talk about how to understand parcel agreements and carrier costs, which are often overlooked. And carrier costs come in a lot of different flavors. The pickup density and delivery density drive costs fairly immensely. How many packages do they pick up at each location? How many packages they deliver to each location? The more density there is, the lower the cost and the more aggressive the pricing can get. More recently, weights and dimensions continue to be a major factor as well. Carriers are looking for the most dense packages. It takes up the least amount of space and they can charge the most for those. So they're very attractive if you have dense packages. Things like commercial and residential shipments can determine cost as well. Commercial specifically are generally cheaper to serve than residential and are more attractive. So if you have a lot of commercial, that can be a good reason to drive pricing. Whether or not there are a lot of claims is another factor. If you have glass items or easily breakable items, the carriers are constantly having to issue refunds for claims. That can be problematic. And special handling has become another big item, especially with peak surcharges on additional handling items, which we'll look at later. Things that require 2 people to lift, for example, are very costly to service, and things that the carriers would generally prefer to not have in their network. And if they do have that in their network, they usually ask you to pay a premium for those services. And even things like seasonality and sales commissions can come into play. Seasonality specifically can be a big one. If you don't have a lot of packages that ship in December, medical devices and healthcare oftentimes are not seasonal. And if that's the case, that can be a very good reason for increased or better pricing, or at least a reason to drive down carrier costs, because if there's little seasonality, they don't have to worry as much about those packages during their traditional peak. The main thing to keep in mind during all of this is that pricing is highly subjective and it's always negotiable. No matter what you're told, pricing is always negotiable. It's just a matter of knowing what levers to pull. To be able to do that, like we mentioned, understanding the pricing agreement itself is critical. And we'll go through quickly some of the items that you'll encounter in that contract. First one being base incentives, and this is a UPS ground commercial matrix. So if we take an example package of zone 2 5-pound, for example, this particular customer would get a 25% base discount. And then you would need to look at your revenue tiers. Can be called earn discounts with FedEx or portfolio incentives with UPS. Revenue tiers are often also used, but you would need to look up your revenue tier based on your current attainment, which can be found in an invoice. So if you want to look up where you fall in this, look at your invoice. The first few pages will show where your attainment is. So in this case, this particular customer has 6 bands. We're going to assume they're in band 3. So they would look up the ground commercial and add 6% to the discount that was shown on the last screen. So 31% total maximum discount, and that's before minimum charges are applied. And we'll show you how that minimum charges impact later as well. Also want to make sure that it applies to the package you're shipping. So we could see, for example, returns and undeliverable would be incentivized here. So make sure that it does apply. Another item that we commonly see or somewhat frequently see are rebates, and things to look out for here are what are the rebates based off of. And in this case, we have a rebate based off of net transportation. So the earned discounts and the revenue tiers we saw in the last screen are based off of gross or base transportation rates, but this is actually after the discounts are applied, subject to all applicable minimums. So this 7% that you might think you're attaining might not be what it seems. So this would be applied only after discounts and subject to minimums. So if you ship mostly low weight items, this may not be any benefit whatsoever. And it's important to understand how that works. These can get pretty complicated. So this one on a UPS shipper for the top tier requires 13 million in spend, 10 million of which has to be small package, 1 million in supply chain services, and 2 million in freight. So important to understand what is necessary to attain a rebate should it be offered. So critical to understand how they're actually applied. And like I mentioned, the agreements are very complicated and intentionally so. And some of the things that we notice that shippers overlook or what we consider agreement gotchas are what we're going to highlight next. And the first one is the general rate increases. Now, most shippers are aware of general rate increases, but it's important to understand how they're applied. There are always increases to published rates and surcharges. There's usually a fair amount of service guide changes that occur when the GRIs take place. DIM changes can also be in there. And as we'll see, these can occur and absolutely do occur throughout the year now, not necessarily at the beginning of each year. And they can definitely be confusing and misleading, as we'll see. Each year, usually in November, December, carriers will announce a 4.9% increase on transportation. And that's what this red bar represents. But as you can see, when you break down the actual increases for each of these services by zone, there are lots of services and zones that actually take more than a 4.9% increase. So that 4.9% increase will affect each shipper differently. And it's important to understand how it affects you. And it's something that your carrier rep can help you understand and tell you exactly how it will affect you. If you're affected by more than 4.9%, maybe that's a good time to renegotiate. So you can see here the items that would be above 4.9 for UPS, and it's very similar with FedEx. So really important to understand how it affects you. And as I mentioned, these GRIs and the rate increases can and do occur throughout the year. They're basically rate increases, and most of them have been designed around COVID surcharges and peak surcharges with the idea that UPS and FedEx are over capacity and should be compensated for being over capacity. It's important to understand how they affect you, but it's also important to realize how prevalent they are and that you need to at least factor in some kind of budgeting for these increases that are going to be unexpected. Here we can see 16 total changes just from UPS from February 11th, 2020 to April 9th of 2021. 16 different increases or changes rather. So keep up to date on those, understand how they affect your shipping. And then how do you mitigate GRIs? Is it even possible? Well, the most common way to do that is through rate caps. And this is an example of a shipper who negotiated a 3.5% rate cap. And the rate cap just means the GRI cannot be more than that capped amount for transportation. So in this case, we have a $21 million shipper with a cap of 3.9%. We're going to assume that the carrier announced 4.9 and that 4.9 is actually the increase that this shipper would take. We're also assuming annual growth from the shipper of 7%. And we can see here from the savings column how these savings compound year over year and why this is so important. If you're able to get a cap negotiated, it can generate lots and lots of savings as the agreement continues versus uncapped. This $21 million annual shipper with some growth saved about $6 million over the course of 5 years just from this cap alone. So very important to negotiate these if you're able to. The next thing that we want to look at are minimum charges and how they affect shippers. Minimum charges for sure affect low weight shippers the most. They also affect low zone shippers. And ultimately what they do is mitigate the discounts from your contract. So it might say that you have a 40% discount, but if you're shipping low weight, low zone, you're generally not receiving 40% discount. And they do affect all services, not just ground. This example we're going to show you is from ground. And this is pulled from a FedEx agreement. This is the minimum charge indexed to the zone 2 1 pound minimum. And it's done this way so that they can increase it during the GRI every year without asking you. So right now in 2021, this is what the rate table would look like. And we can see the minimum charge for zone 2 1 pounds, $8.76. And for this hypothetical shipper, This is what their rate chart would look like after discounts are applied based on this rate chart or these discounts in the upper right. And then after we actually apply the zone 2 £1 minimum charge, all of the red cells here are where the shipper would not be receiving their full contractual discount. So if you have shipments that are generally £2 and under, you won't be receiving you won't be receiving the maximum amount of discounts for those. If you're a mostly zone 2 shipper, all the way up to 25 pounds, you won't be receiving the full discount. So it's important to understand how it impacts you, and then if it does, negotiate appropriately. So the next question would be, how do you negotiate these? Well, the first step really is just to quantify the impact and ask for it. To ask is really the first step. And the next step is, well, what do you really ask for? And as much as you can, get out into the marketplace and benchmark. If you've made any acquisitions or have any partner companies or anybody in the marketplace that's of similar size that you're able to reach out to and communicate with, that could be a potential area. We can offer assistance there, obviously, as well. We see hundreds of these all the time. So you have a really good idea at various spend levels what an appropriate benchmark would be. But it is very important to ask for this if you're low weight. If you are getting any rebates, like I mentioned on the previous slide, make sure that the minimum charges do not apply if possible. And then you can also look at alternative services like postal service, Smart Post or SurePost. You can look at postal consolidators. Generally, those prices will be lower for lower weights. And also look at regionals. If you have a lot of shipping within a regional footprint, in most cases, if you ship enough volume, regionals can be cheaper and faster as well. The third item that we want to look at is dimensional weight. And if you're unfamiliar with how dimensional weight works, essentially it's a simple equation. You compare the actual weight of the package to this equation, and this is the one we should be focused on for list rate shipping. That's the length times the width times the height of the package divided by your dimensional divisor, which the base rate for that is 139. The base dimensional divisor is 139 right now. And you can see how this has changed over the years from 194 to 166 to 139. So if the answer to this equation rounded up is greater than the actual weight, that's what you'll actually pay. And if you have a lot of packaging that's inefficient, or maybe you have items that have to be protected and there's a lot of air in the packages, this can get quite expensive. Just to illustrate, here's a 6-pound zone 6 2-day shipment, 18 by 12 by 12. And these are the prices you would pay at various DIMs. And you can see the rated weight here. And as we get to a lower and lower DIM factor, we can see how these increases occur. If you're shipping this package with a standard DIM, the weight and pricing increases over 135%. So it can be absolutely critical for some shippers to negotiate this or otherwise reduce package volume. And then finally on DIM weight, review your invoices for the billed versus actual. Now, just focus on the blue bars here. The red bars are actually a subset of the blue bars, but this shipper sent out 24 million pounds roughly. They were billed for almost 32 million pounds for a delta of a little over 8 million pounds. So this is weight that they were billed for, but not actually put in the boxes. If there's any way to reduce that via a DIM factor or via better packaging, it's absolutely critical that you do so, because this is just extra weight that hopefully you don't have to pay for via negotiation or package improvement. Similar to contract negotiation and understanding those, it's also critical, and something that we find doesn't happen very often, is to properly analyze carrier offers. And the way that we do it is simply to look at some of the things that we just talked about. So this is a FedEx example on the left and a UPS example on the right. But our recommendation would be to break this down by service type so we can get a good understanding of not only the services that are being used the most, but also the discount levels at various weight breaks, and to see how the spend breaks down as well. So we can see this particular shipper on the left is heavily concentrated in Smart Post. And this discount is actually an effective discount after minimum charges. So you can easily pull the total discount from the agreement, but it's important to understand what is the discount after minimums. And then simply benchmark this against how your contract looks in terms of the discounts printed and what you think might be appropriate based on any benchmarking that you've done. And to give you some illustrations on things to look for, here's how we break down actual versus discount received. So these red bars here are what would be printed in a customer contract. And the blue bars are what they're actually receiving after minimum charges. So this delta represents some opportunity for potential improvement and something that we would look to mitigate as much as possible. Other things that we like to look at are accessorial charges, which can also be critical. And I mentioned earlier that part of our business is on the technology side. This is some snapshots from our portal and some of the information that we display in our portal so that you can make decisions based on what your distributions look like. In this case, we have a shipper that's spending roughly 25-ish% of their total shipping spend on accessorial charges. So it's important to dig deeper and see exactly how those break down and if there might be some opportunity. So we can see this shipper has 400,000 in fuel surcharges, a little over 400,000, over 450,000 in residential. We have some delivery area surcharges here. These are shipping charge corrections that are charged after the fact based on generally misbilled dimensions. There would not be opportunity here, and then some other. So once we know that, then we can drill down even further and also point out another thing to look for in the contract, which would be to make sure that all of the services that should be included are included. And delivery area is a big one here. So you want to make sure that if you're shipping both ground and express, that it applies to both services, and that all of the flavors that you use are also discounted, because they don't necessarily become discounted by default. And this is the level of detail that we would normally break something down like this into. So we could see, okay, what areas have the most impact, what can be negotiated, and where do we have opportunity? And just to highlight this a bit more, this is another example of a shipper where we're doing an analysis of this, specifically this residential surcharge. You can see here, this is domestic delivery of ground service at 50% off. When we do the analysis, we see residential only shows an incentive of 28.3%. So why might that be? Well, in this case, this shipper had a lot of express shipments that were being not discounted because this is only from the ground service. So this is another area of opportunity to potentially move this residential for the express side up to a 50% discount and realize savings on all of this. And these are areas that are often overlooked when analyzing these agreements. And then finally, I mentioned peak surcharges. They're here. They're probably here to stay until at least next year. I don't see any way where where either carrier is going to say, okay, we're done with peak this year. COVID is behind us. I think they're just going to transition into traditional peak, and we're going to have to continue to deal with these at least until next year. But this one's just an example of China to US. We could see this was changed just a few weeks ago, so it's important to stay up to date on these. These are peak surcharges that have been applied for a while. This one is for residential and SurePost. You do have to ship more than 25,000 packages. For this, it doesn't apply to a lot of companies, but when it does, it can be pretty dramatic. And then peak surcharges. And this will apply to a lot of additional handling and oversized shippers because you only need 10 per week. These can all be negotiated, but it's important to understand how they affect you and why they're important to reduce. And then finally, once you have everything analyzed and you feel like you understand the agreement, it's important to negotiate appropriately. And like I mentioned before, we do find that a lot of our clients have taken less efficient paths in doing this before. So we'd like to help you with some of the key points on how to do this properly. And number one really is to leverage the competition. The first thing that I would look at as a FedEx pricing analyst is why. Why does this make sense for FedEx or for UPS to dilute your business or to bring on your business at the prices you're asking for? And most of the time, it's usually due to a competitive threat. So if you can provide a competitive threat, or if the non-incumbent has a unique solution to your business that the incumbent isn't offering, those can be great leverage points to come back to your incumbent with. Anytime you can provide leverage in terms of competition, that can be very, very powerful. Once you're negotiating these, a lot of times they try to stop you from doing this. They don't want you to involve their competitors. So they'll ask for things like multi-year agreements with commitments and termination language. And these are really the most important ones. But as you'll see on the next slide, they do look to bundle all of your pricing so that they get it all. These minimum volume commitments and terminations are things that you can push back on. So when they tell you they have to be there, they absolutely do not. They're just looking to limit your negotiating power down the line. Even though we try to push back on portfolio bundles, sometimes that can be a very good leverage point to move to an incumbent shipper with. So if you're dual sourcing now and could consider single sourcing, you might end up with better pricing as a single source. If you are single sourcing and threaten dual sourcing, or the non-incumbent offers pricing, that can be another reason. But essentially, if your rep, one of the reasons why your rep might be interested in diluting your pricing is if there's more opportunity in it for them. If they can bring on additional business and you can show them where that business is, that can be very compelling. Another option is to start a trial with a non-incumbent. Typically, that just can show that you're actually interested in moving the business over. It can show the incumbent that you are seriously also considering moving the shipping over. So even if you don't intend to move business over permanently, showing that that trial came onto their competitor can be very powerful in a way to negotiate with even the incumbent at that point. It also gives you a chance to trial the business, which could overcome any internal obstacles. And you can see what the savings actually looks like and whether or not it's real. Finally, make a strong business case. I'm not going to go through all the rationale here, but these are some of the items that we've used in the past. Like I said, the most important thing is give the carrier a reason why it makes sense for them to do that. We're growing. The competition is supplying free shipping and we need to compete. Our CFO has decided we need to cut costs by 10%, et cetera. Anything that can apply directly to you and can be personalized can often be very powerful. And then before I turn it over to Steve, is a third party worth considering. If you think that you've done the best you can do, we'd be happy to take a look and quantify that for you. So we work on gain share basis, meaning if we don't produce any results, we don't make any money or we don't charge you any money. And we'll also do complementary analyses. So if you're just curious on how your program stacks up, I can look at it or one of my colleagues can look at it and give you a very detailed rating as to where it sits in the marketplace and whether or not we think there's an opportunity. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Steve, who will go through some of these pain points on the 3PL side.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate that. Nice job. All right, so now we're going to jump into the 3PL contract optimization and the pitfalls associated with that. So before we jump in to the specific pitfalls associated with negotiating 3PL agreements, what I wanted to do is just spend a couple of minutes talking about some of the healthcare 3PL market challenges that we see out there on a regular basis. The first one is it's critically important to select the right 3PL partner the first time. I'm sure there's folks on the call that have gotten into relationships with the wrong partner, and it can be extremely detrimental to your business and your customers. And so it's really important going into these relationships that you select a partner that understands the unique support requirements of the healthcare industry and your business in particular, has the appropriate capabilities and certifications to support your business, has effective quality control and internal operating systems, and can support your reverse logistics requirements, things like returns, refurbishments, recalls. The next thing that's critically important to understand in the market, which is a big challenge right now, is just the impact of COVID, especially in the healthcare market. There's been a significant reduction in market capacity, and we're starting to see the effects of that in the form of pricing pressure and price increases. There's numerous options out there. There's over 800 3PLs in North America, and over half of those claim or in one way or another provide some type of support within the healthcare industry. In addition, there's various pricing models out there, so it's important to understand those, and the contracts themselves can be very complex. There's also limited benchmarking available, like Matt touched on. in his session or his part of the session. It's really important to understand how your pricing stacks up, and there's really limited benchmarking available in the 3PL market. And then there's also limited visibility into and financial relief for service failures. So it's important to structure your agreements so that you're protected in that area. In terms of understanding 3PL pricing, pitfall number one, there's some specific things that you need to look at. When you're trying to understand 3PL pricing and how your contract and your relationship stacks up, the first thing you want to look at is benchmarking, and benchmarking your contract and your rates against the market. Unfortunately, there's very limited benchmarking information available. So how do you know if you have good pricing? Matt touched on a few ways to do it. Obviously, Shipware can help. We've got a lot of information and data available. In addition to benchmarking, there's various 3PL pricing models available out there. So you really got to understand what model your 3PL functions under. Some 3PLs make the majority of their profit off of freight-based margin. Others make their profit off of pick and pack based margin. Still further, companies use a hybrid model where they have a markup on the freight and the pick and pack, and they make margin in both areas. There's some 3PLs that bundle their pricing and give you one price for everything all in. And for many large contracts, they're on a cost plus basis. So it's important to ask specific questions to understand what's included in your pricing and each of the line items within the contract. So, probably the biggest component of your spend with the 3PL is going to be freight. So it's really important to have a clear understanding of how the parcel and LTL freight costs work. As Matt pointed out, there's a lot of nuances and complexities to how parcel and LTL pricing works. So it's really important to understand the discounts you're receiving off of published weights by service and weight band, the discounts you're receiving off of accessorial fees, the DIM divisor that the 3PL is using for your shipments, and the minimum charge reductions that you're receiving. Most 3PLs don't give complete visibility and transparency to their customers. If you ask the questions in contract negotiations around these specific areas of the parcel and LTL freight costs, they'll share the information with you and you can negotiate it. But if you don't ask the question, most likely you're going to end up paying published rates and a 139 DIM divisor. So pitfall number two is analyzing 3PL services proposals. Usually when you're looking at analyzing the proposals, you're in some type of contract review or RFP process. So in order to have an effective RFP process, it's really important to lay the foundation for effective proposal analysis. So when you're developing the requirements for the RFP and you're issuing it to the 3PLs, give very specific guidance to the 3PLs regarding support requirements. Provide historical and projected volume information and package configuration data so that they can really understand what they're getting into and give you the most aggressive pricing possible. The challenge is if you don't give them specific guidance, they're going to make assumptions. And typically when they make assumptions, they're going to pad the cost, pad the margin, and the prices in their proposal will be increased. It's also really important to provide the 3PLs with data so that they can give you sample order pricing for direct-to-consumer and B2B orders. Also, develop and leverage a standard pricing template for bid solicitations. So when you go to RFP or you go out to bid, give them very specific instructions and guidelines regarding how you want the pricing to be formatted and what you want included in each of the areas. So request the pricing in a very specific format and give clear guidance and transaction data and shipping analytics so that they can put the pricing into your format. If you don't do that, it's going to make it very difficult to analyze and compare and contrast the bids that you receive. So use standard and also use standardized analysis templates when comparing the pricing proposals. So if you develop a template for bid solicitation, you can use the same template slightly modified for proposal analysis, which streamlines the process and makes it a lot more efficient. The second part of analyzing the 3PL services proposals is really getting into detailed analytics and analysis regarding the pricing that's been submitted. So I think the one thing that I learned over many years of experience that makes things a lot easier is break it down into individual components. So analyze the pricing based on major category. So receiving, storage, pick and pack, administrative fees, and then freight. And if you analyze those by service, by bid, it makes it a lot easier to compare and contrast the bids that you receive. Always compute the estimated cost per order for direct-to-consumer and B2B shipments, because the bids are quite a bit different. Some costs are a little higher in some areas, a little lower in other areas. To level the playing field and really be able to do an apples-to-apples comparison, if you look at some sample orders and do some sample order computations for fulfillment and parcel and LTL freight, it can really help you to analyze and understand the proposals better. And then the other key configuration or consideration is to compute the cost and time and transit impact of the different site location options. So when you go out and solicit bids, it's highly unlikely that you're going to get bids from all different 3PLs in the exact same location, especially if you're, a national or North American or global company that has multi-site location needs. You're going to end up talking to 3PLs that have slightly different footprints and will be shipping from slightly different locations, or maybe even significantly different locations. So it's important to understand the inbound freight and the outbound freight impact of those site locations, and things like time in transit and the freight costs and how that's going to impact your customers and your cost to operate your program. The third pitfall, which we discussed, is really failing to negotiate effectively. So always use benchmarking analytics to highlight specific savings opportunities. So when you go into negotiations, it's always really helpful to understand how the proposals that you receive stack up against best in class. That data is many times very difficult to come by. So, it's super important to look at all your different alternatives when benchmarking. Also focused on the largest cost savings opportunities. I see all the time clients get hung up on, this is really out of whack. We got to negotiate this line item, when it's, in the overall scheme of things, a relatively insignificant portion of the spend. So focused on the largest cost savings opportunities. Typically, it's going to be freight, pick and pack, storage, also the largest growth opportunities. So how your business is scaling and which areas are potentially going to grow the most. So focus your negotiations on those areas of growth for the future. Also consider multi-year contracts in exchange for lower rates or rate caps. Matt touched on rate caps in the parcel side. It's also very important on the 3PL side. The next bullet is incorporate a detailed statement of work into the MSA. It's super important to make sure that the requirements and all of the support criteria, roles and responsibilities are clearly laid out in the MSA. So both parties know exactly what's required of them, and it also protects your best interests. The more detailed the SOW is, the better. When you're negotiating your agreements, always negotiate service level agreements and guarantees into the agreement as well. And focus on the areas that are most important to your customers and to you. Things like order turn time, order accuracy, returns processing. Those are all, specific SLAs that are going to impact customer satisfaction and customer engagement. And so it's super important to make sure that the 3PL is meeting your specific commitment requirements in those areas, and they're guaranteeing their services. And finally, incorporate continuous, well, actually there's one more point, incorporate a continuous improvement process into the MSA. So it's important to have, quarterly or semi-annual business reviews to go through the SLAs, to review opportunities for improvement, to work strategically and in partnership with your 3PL to identify opportunities for improvement. And finally, consider this kind of a unique approach that we try to take with all of our large accounts, is consider a 3PL performance incentives. So in many cases, 3PLs identify opportunities for improvement, but by making those suggestions, they're actually going to cut into their margin and their revenue, right? They come up with suggestions that make things more efficient, reduce cost, it actually impacts their bottom line. So if you create performance incentives for them to come to the table with good ideas and deliver efficiencies, it can be a win-win for both parties. So in summary, we covered a lot of information here, and really our goal was to give you some actionable insights and some nuggets that can be leveraged in your own contract negotiations. But in summary, parcel and 3PL contracts are more complex than ever. Your optimization strategy is really dependent upon in-house versus outsourced fulfillment support and the key cost drivers associated with your specific model. So if it's an in-house solution, the biggest component and probably the most benefit that you're going to receive is going to come from parcel carrier direct agreement contract optimization. If it's an outsourced solution, then the benefit you're going to receive is from 3PL fulfillment and freight contract optimization. And then obviously if you insource and outsource, it'll include both. On the parcel side, there's really a limited number of carriers and a focus on margin, which makes it very difficult to optimize those carrier agreements. And then on the 3PL side, there's a large number of 3PLs with different pricing structures, which makes it challenging to optimize 3PL contracts. The key steps in contract optimization, regardless of whether it's carrier or 3PL, is understanding the pricing agreements, leveraging program analytics, and really understanding your business at a detailed level. Benchmarking your contracts and your pricing, doing detailed proposal analysis, effective contract negotiations, and it's an ongoing process. So continuous improvement is super important. And then, like we stated a couple slides ago, focus on the areas that are going to deliver the largest impact. And if you need assistance in this area, benchmarking and optimization assistance is available and will deliver a significant ROI. As Matt alluded to, we're in the business of optimizing these agreements. We do hundreds of them a year. We've got thousands and thousands of agreements in our database. So we have significant benchmarking available at our disposal that our customers can take advantage of. And if we can be of assistance in this area, we'd be happy to help you. Otherwise, we hope we've gotten some benefit out of this session. And that's the end of the presentation portion. And now we're going to shift over to some Q&A.
Thanks, Steve. I'll go ahead and handle some of the questions. If anyone has any additional questions, please continue to submit those via the Zoom link. Someone did ask about this presentation. We'll definitely provide access to that, and our contact information is located in here as well. If you have any specific questions for us that we may not address, feel free to follow up with us after this. That said, we do have a few questions here. Again, feel free to submit some more. There's one on the 3PL side, so I guess Steve, we'll start with that, and then a couple more on the parcel side, somewhat more on the parcel side. So let's handle the 3PL one first. Is it better to negotiate your own parcel carrier agreements and rates, or is it generally better to use 3PL rates?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It really depends on your business. There's a lot of factors involved in answering that question. It's not completely cut and dry, but at a high level, 3PLs are aggregators of services. The way that they make their money is they aggregate services, including freight, and they leverage all that volume to go out and negotiate significant discounts. And then they pass some of that savings on to the client. The pricing models are significantly different, 3PL to 3PL. The rate structures are different. So it's really hard to understand how good those rates are unless you take a hard look at them. But in general, if you have a freight spend with a 3PL that's in the $2 to $4 million range, there's a high probability that you're going to be able to negotiate better rates yourself and would be able to carve out that spend, negotiate your own contract, and deliver savings. So there's a number of factors involved, but if your spend is in the neighborhood of 2 to 4 million, there's a high probability that you'd be able to deliver some cost savings by having your own carrier agreements.
Thanks, Steve. One of the questions here that we have, mostly on the parcel side, I believe, is how to diversify carrier mix to avoid problems with pickups during peak. As a lot of you may know, and maybe still are under some issues getting pickups during peak last year, and even throughout last year when COVID first came into play, a lot of shippers were having problems getting their packages picked up from FedEx and from UPS. We've certainly heard stories where UPS was just limiting trailers to longtime shippers and just refusing to pick up packages. Generally speaking, we found that happens the most, the better the pricing on that contract is. So from what I had seen anecdotally, especially, that the better the pricing was, the less attractive the margins were to the carrier, the more likely it would be that they would refuse to pick up packages during busy times. So how can you avoid that? Well, a lot of it is depending on a bunch of factors. The first one, and probably the most prevalent, would be the amount of shipping that you actually do. If you're in the smaller side of shipping, I'd say 500,000 and below, what I would classify as smaller side, it may make more sense to just single source and most likely have lesser chances of there being problems during peak season. You can always reach out to a non-incumbent for pricing so that you don't have to ship on list rates if something were to happen. But in most cases, if you're on the lower end of the spectrum in terms of spend, it's hard to get appropriate level discounts for half your business in like a dual source scenario. Now, if you're much larger, let's say a $10 million shipper, for example, now splitting that business may be more appropriate, or at least less detrimental to the overall pricing from various outlets. So let's assume you're 10 million, you have low weight shipments, some higher weight shipments. You could look at things like regional carriers are a big one that we touched on briefly in this presentation, but are being more and more utilized by lots and lots of different companies. Regional carriers, if you're unfamiliar, only ship within a given footprint in the United States. Right now, all the regionals can handle about 90% of the United States, and the top ones, I believe, is around 65%. But if you have a lot of packages within their footprint, you can have another outlet for your packages. Oftentimes, they'll be cheaper than what they were with FedEx and UPS. And also, the transit times will generally be faster. We had a follow-up question. Spend of carriers like 10 million per carrier is 10 million net spend or gross spend before discount. I was referencing net spend. 10 million, it was just a ballpark, but 10 million gross spend would probably qualify or be a good candidate for this type of strategy as well. There's no hard and fast rule, that's for sure. What I'm mainly getting at is the larger you are, the more likely it is that adding an additional carrier makes more sense. Another option for lightweight shippers would be to involve the Postal Service directly or through postal consolidators, like some of the ones we had mentioned, which is like OSM, Pitney Bowes Logistic, DHL e-commerce are other ones, so that they can provide services at various speed levels that will generally be cheaper than shipping them, certainly ground or even SmartPost, SurePost. But all of those are good options to diversify. I would encourage you, if this solution sounds like it could be a fit for you, is to act fairly quickly on it, because we have heard from some of the alternative carriers that they are experiencing lots and lots of demand and may start, as they did last year, cutting off new contracts and new shippers. And that did occur last year. We're hearing that that could occur relatively soon this year. So if that is a strategy that's interesting to you, it's a good time to reach out now. Even for smaller amounts, if it sounds like this could be a strategy, I would encourage you to reach out and explore the viability. And we can certainly assist with that as well. Last question we have here, and again, feel free to add on, but how do you determine when the contract is optimized? How do you know that it's optimized after you've gone through the negotiation? And I think both of us can probably speak a little bit to this. And it's a tricky one. I'll go ahead and start and just say that it is difficult. It's difficult to determine that. And the way that we do it is really through our benchmarking process. So we know what a $2 million shipper should be spending or generally does spend. And then we also know what is possible for that type of shipper in a given environment, which can be difficult to do. One of the best ways you could do it on your own is to, as we mentioned, involve the competition. And if you'd like to have a second set of eyes on it, we're certainly here to help as well. So we can look at current pricing and give you an idea of how close to optimal it is, or if it's optimal, we'll tell you that too. Steve, did you have any comments on that on the 3PL side?
Yeah, it's somewhat similar on the 3PL side. Usually we use benchmarking as the starting point to put our target pricing together. And then if we're able to achieve that target pricing, we feel pretty good that the contract's optimized. A lot of times there'll be negotiations going back and forth, and we won't be able to get quite to the targets that we put in place that were pretty aggressive from the get-go. But a lot of times what we'll do in the 11th hour in those negotiations is, if we feel there's still a little bit of room for improvement, in the 11th hour, we'll negotiate tiered pricing. So there are rate reductions or incentives that the customer will receive based on additional growth. So that's a strategy that we use from time to time. But typically, if we can get close to the benchmarking strategy that we developed and the target pricing strategy that we developed, we feel pretty good about fully optimized contracts.
Thanks, Steve. That is actually the last question. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Olivia, but do want to thank everybody for their attention today and for the questions. Again, if you have any more questions or think of anything after we get done, please do feel free to reach out to either of us. We'd be happy to explore any of your questions in more detail after the fact.